This is Georgina Rose, and welcome to the Postmodern Iconoclast, a podcast that helps you destroy and break the false icons and idols of the digital age in search of a more authentic esoteric spirituality. On this podcast, we discuss ideology, esoterica, and everything on the fringes of mysticism, religion, and related topics. We are now recording, just so you know, and I guess we'll get started. Hello and welcome to the podcast. This is your host, Georgina Rose, and in this episode, we're going to be talking about the connection between the Orphic cults and Christianity, specifically early Christianity. Our guest here has he's been on the show before, and we're excited to have him back, and he covers a lot of these subjects. Can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Neil. I have a channel called Gnostic Informant on YouTube. And we get into ancient history, mythology, comparative religion, and stuff like that.
Lovely. So, kind of where I want to start is just asking what is the connection between the Orphic cults and Christianity? Because I think it's a connection that a lot of people are completely unaware of.
Oh, wow. Great question. So the Orphics, from my understanding, the Orphics in the ancient world, especially in the Greek world, were these group of religious, um, they were a group of people in a religion that was based on like piety and the the process of going through rites, ritual, singing, like, for example, Orphics would sing a hymn to a god, let's say, Nyx, goddess of night, and they would have prescribed rituals, which incense to burn, how to do it, what time to do it. And the Orphics really set the stage for like organized religion, if that makes sense. Like they really, like the Orphics come along during a time when religion was just all localized. Everywhere you went, everyone had their own rites. But the Orphics come along and start a religious movement that transcends geography. There's Orphics everywhere. The Pythagoreans, like the texts that are attributed to Pythagoras are always looking back to the Orphics. The Platonists as well are always contributing their ideas to Orphic ideas. So Orphics, when it comes to Christianity comes during a time when Judaism is becoming Hellenized, and some of the earliest texts from the first century BC or second century BC that are texts of people who are Jewish from Alexandria, Egypt, mostly, but other places as well. They're attributing Orpheus as a prophet in the sense like Moses is. So they're taking on Orpheus and this religious movement, and they're sort of marrying each other. And I think, and there's other people who think this too. It's not like this might not be like mainstream academic, but I think that marriage between Orphism and Judaism is where Christianity comes out of. So, because Christianity is very much a Hellenized form of Judaism. The Gospels are all Greek, obviously. Some of the things that you get in Christianity align with Orphic ideals, and so yeah, there was people in Alexandria. One of the texts is from Aristobulus, who we don't have his text, but we have fragments of it. And he's talking about how there was people in Alexandria arguing and debating over who taught who. Did Orpheus teach Moses, or did Moses teach Orpheus? And obviously all the Jews are like, no, Moses is way before Orpheus. And all the Greeks are saying, well, no, we actually know that Orpheus was the son of Musaeus, or Musaeus was the son of Orpheus. And it was the other way around. So there's like this entanglement happening between the Orphics and the Jews living in Alexandria.
Calling Christianity a Hellenized form of Judaism I really like that. I've never heard anyone phrase it like that. And it makes me think of, so we know that Platonism heavily influenced Christian thought to the point where a lot of Christian theologians called the Platonists, who were polytheistic, righteous pagans, and kind of gave them their own little category. And I bring this up a fair amount, and people like they try to remove Platonism out of its original context because of how like people associate with Christianity now. That I actually, it was funny, I was having a conversation with some people and I was talking about polytheistic Platonist ideas, and someone's like, oh well, you're Christianizing polytheism. And I was like, no, that actually that happened in reverse. There's
Yeah,
parallels because this came from that, right?
yeah, yeah. Plato is one of the most cited Greek philosophers from these Greek-speaking Jewish writers. Philo is a big one. Philo, he lived in the first century BC and in the first century. He lived in both centuries. He loves Plato. He's always talking about how holy and righteous Plato was. If only he had, if only he, had the true religion and stuff like that. Josephus also says similar things about Plato, because Plato, what Plato is. So people talk about monotheism, and they think it's just like Judaism invented it or something. It's like, no, monotheism was like a movement that came over time through this. I want to like I sometimes attribute it to Plato, even though it's not just his idea. But Plato is the person who really takes on all of the knowledge from Athens from the last two. He lived in the 5th century BCE, and so the 2 centuries before him, you have all these thinkers like Thales, Anaximenes, Socrates, Archelaus. These are all the masters of Athens that came before Plato. And Plato comes along and he takes all this knowledge and sort of puts it into his dialogues. And he comes up with this theory of forms. And in his Timaeus, he has this creator god, the demiurge, um, this Platonic good concept. It's all good, all perfect. And this is you see this in Zoroastrianism too, in Persia, where there's this idea of, yeah, there's this one god on top of everything, but there's also lesser deities below it. And then, so what I think happens in Christianity is they're not taking out the other gods; they're just calling them angels and demons. So you just have like it's just a language argument. We're just arguing over the linguistics over, do lesser gods exist or are they angels and demons? Does it really matter? Does it really make a difference what we call them? But I think the Christians are, you said it perfectly. Like, they are so heavily influenced by Platonism. Middle Platonism is the leading philosophy of the day during first century, and what it is it's basically Platonism plus Stoicism. And because Stoicism was just so dominant, like the Stoics were winning all the debates. The Stoics were just crushing. So the Platonists, instead of trying to defeat the Stoics, they sort of co-opt them, and then you get Middle Platonism. Christianity, all of its texts, like Paul, the writings of Paul to the parables of Jesus, all of it has that layer of Middle Platonism behind it. And like people who study philosophy, ancient philosophy, well, those are the ones that are bringing this to the forefront and showing people, hey, look, here's this text, here's how it aligns with some of these other Platonist texts. Plato was one of the first people to come along and like challenge Homer. So this is actually in the Republic in book 3, where Homer says, through the mouth of Socrates, he says, Homer is great and all, and I know he's a legend and he's the greatest. He's Homer, but I don't think he's right. I think we need to change religion. And like I'm paraphrasing here, obviously, but he more or less says we need to change religion so it's better for people to grow up and learn from, because the stuff that Homer's teaching people is kind of like, oh, it's okay to like, be a warrior and go kill people and have a bunch of sex or whatever. And Plato sort of comes in this, and this comes from the Orphics, this idea of piety, of having like restrictions on bodily desires. And Plato sort of argues that Homer isn't good anymore; he's outdated. We need to update our religious text or religious myths or whatever for the youth, so that they can have And he says things like Achilles being depicted in Hades as someone who's crying. That's not how we should depict our heroes. Our heroes need to be always never crying. They need to be, stern, and they need to be like thinking that the afterlife is a good place, not a bad place. And so he sort of takes Homer and flips it on its head and gives us this new movement. And so Plato actually dethrones Homer in that way. And that dethroning of Homer by Plato sets up the stage for Judeo-Christianity to come along with the right mythology for to match, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and one thing you mentioned that I do like to stress is Abrahamicism and monotheism are actually not the same thing. And there's a number of monotheistic religions in the world now that do not fall underneath the Abrahamic tent, right? To be Abrahamic, it has to be from the lineage of Abraham. Whereas
Yeah.
not all monotheistic religions, historic and present, actually have anything to do with that.
Okay.
Monotheism emerged in a number of different ways in a number of different places. And it was not all this singular, unbroken lineage, right? That I think a lot of people think of it as now. Like,
Yeah, exactly. And there's actually some scholars who are looking at the text of the Old Testament and pointing out like instances where it looks like there's polytheism happening. Like there's like Job is a good example of this. There's some scholars who point out that Job's coming along and mentioning how there's these sons of God in this text. Elohim is plural. They're pointing this stuff out, and they're saying that it's possible that around the 3rd century BCE, at the same time the Septuagint is translating these Hebrew texts, they're sort of editing them and taking the polytheistic aspects away and making it more of a monotheistic spin. And the reason why they think that is the evidence shows that even as late as the 5th century BC, where we have there's a Jewish community living in Elephantine in Egypt, and in their text you got Osiris and Isis and uh, all these different gods next to Yahweh, and they're completely polytheistic even as late as 500 BC, and it's all of a sudden around the time of Hellenism, around the time after Plato, all of a sudden you start getting pure monotheism from Judaism. So I think there was a merge. I think, and there's other people who think this, but once again, this is one of those things that are probably not mainstream scholars. I think that Platonism and Judaism, just like Stoicism and Platonism later on does, sort of marry each other, and that's where you get this new form of Judaism. I think Platonism is actually uh, attributes to that. If that makes sense.
yeah, that sort of polytheistic Judaism reminds me of another place where that popped up, which is the Himyarite kingdom in modern day. It's a section of Yemen. And before Islam sort of overtook that region in the conquest, they had their own kingdom, right? And they were Jews. They identified as Jews. Their descendants are Yemeni Jews now, as well as just people in Yemen who lived under that rule. But their religion was nothing like the Judaism we see today because they would praise like Hashem, but then they also worshipped this deity Shams, who appeared in several places around the peninsula, and they considered her the national deity of their people. And so it's so interesting is in their rituals they would invoke Shams and then end it by saying like Amen and invoking that Abrahamic god Hashem. So
Yeah.
yeah, this non-monotheistic thing did very much exist, actually in several places.
Yeah, there's actually I'm glad you just reminded me. So another example of some scholars pointing out polytheistic stuff in the Old Testament is in Deuteronomy. And that's you're like, Deuteronomy, that's the law codes. That's gotta how's that gonna be well, there's a ritual, there's a prescribed to the Levites, and it's for Yom Kippur. And it says, take one goat and bring it out in the wilderness for Azazel, and take the other goat and slaughter it in the temple for the sins of the people for Yahweh. And you look at this text and you're thinking, who's Azazel? And if it's polytheistic, you're like, oh, that makes sense. It's just another deity. You're just offering something to another deity. And but like in a monotheistic sense, so what they end up doing is Christians do this later on. They say, oh, that's just another name for Satan. And it's like, yeah, really though? I don't know. That isn't. Why not just say Satan then? Like, why would you change the name to Azazel if it's Satan? So what they end up doing is they all these Baal or Moloch, any cases in the Old Testament where you get another deity, it just becomes Satan, under the Christian mindset, under the later Judeo-Christian mindset. But at the time when these texts were written, it's pretty obvious that when these texts were written, they were meant to be. There's a God named Azazel, and there's a God named Yahweh, and this is the ritual that we're going to do. So that's why, and there's so many examples like that, you know.
Azazel gets interesting because if you look at the sigil for Azazel that the occult Christians did, like the Christian occultist, right, who did the binding of the demons, those people, they drew a sigil for Azazel, and the sigil
Yeah,
actually matches the traditional planetary sigil for Saturn. And
yep.
Saturn is obviously the same Saturn Chronos, right? And so
Mm,
you get with that myth, and this is my own extrapolation, this is not sourced from anything,
sure.
this interesting parallel of like Azazel is this wilderness demon in the Yom Kippur story, but also if we look to the Greco-Roman interpretation, Kronos, Saturn, ruled over this previous era and then was overthrown by his son, who he then tried to consume and then failed at. And so there's an
Yeah,
interesting little connection there.
and there's
Um,
another one too with Saturn, because obviously Saturn's day is the Sabbath, right? But on top of that, there's an ancient text that we lost, but it's well documented. It's cited all the time by ancient authors. It's a priest from the Bronze Age. We're going back to 1200 BCE here, and they cite this guy. His name's Sancho the Eighth, and the only fragment of we have survives through a Phoenician writer named Philo of Byblos, and then his text that gets lost, and that gets pushed into Porphyry, and then Porphyry and Eusebius, the Christian historian, they preserve these texts in their writing. So we can barely we had the text, but we don't know how much of it is edited or what. We just have to like look at it and read between the lines. Anyways, in this text, the god El, by the way, that's the Hebrew name for God, El. If you read the Hebrew Bible, it doesn't say God, it says El. So an Elohim means gods. It's plural for God, right? So El is Saturn. So Philo of Byblos, the guy who's passing down this text by this Bronze Age priest, says El, who the Greeks call Kronos, was deified as the star Saturn. And then he tells this story about El, and it's almost the same story from as the story of Abraham. So you have this god whose name is El. He's taking his only son. It says only begotten son too. Puts him on an altar and sacrifices him. And so in the story of Abraham, he gets stopped by an angel at the last second. In this story, there's no stopping. He does it. And then after he does that, it gets even. So if that was only it by itself, I would say, well, it's kind of cool. They line up pretty well. But there's another thing it says that he circumcises himself and makes it a custom for the Phoenicians to do this from this day forward. That's also in the story of Abraham. Abraham is the one in the Old Testament who starts the circumcision rite. So now we have two different things, two elements in this story that line up with Abraham, but it's not Abraham. It's the god El, who he says is Saturn. He literally says who the Greeks call Kronos and is deified as the star Saturn. And it's like when I saw that, I just said, "Wow, this is crazy!" Like, and it makes you wonder: is this part of that polytheistic history that gets sort of gets changed over time as philosophy, as Platonism influences theology? They sort of take. Are these the texts that become what is now the Old Testament? You know what I mean?
oh yeah, everything comes from what is before it. And when these religions pop up, they always pull from their predecessor, often in ways that really kind of almost show a concurrent metaphysical current. Now,
Yeah.
one thing I wanted to talk with you about is you wanted to speak, and I think it's worth talking about the relationship between Medea and the Orphic mysteries. Can you get into that?
Yeah, for sure. So Medea, I also want to start with like the history behind it. So Medea, before we get to Medea, there is a Egyptian pharaoh named Sesostris, and he's written about by Manetho, who's a Egyptian priest, as well as Herodotus, way back in the 5th century BC, and um, and Diodorus of Sicily. So they're all talking about this pharaoh. And the story is actually, I can just read what it says in Manetho real quick. It's really short. He says, he conquered all Asia in 9 years and Europe as far as Thrace. He erected monuments everywhere to announce his power over the nations, inscribing on the monuments male genitals for brave people and female genitals for the cowardly. Because of his deeds, he was ranked next to Osiris by the Egyptians. Now, if you look at Herodotus and Diodorus, they say similar stuff about him, a little bit different. Like one of them says that he basically ran through the Middle East, defeated the Assyrians, defeated the Hittites, defeated everybody, and all the way up to where modern day Russia is, and which is like right now Ukraine, and conquers all of that, and then as far as the borders of India to the east and Italy to the west. So he has this entire world, known world, I should say, because that's like the known world at that time. Is like for like this, to the perspective of Babylon and Egypt. You know what I mean? So he conquers all that, and then he plants this kingdom in the north, right where Ukraine is right now, called Colchis. And in this kingdom, this so he so his this he has a descendant named Aetes, Aeetes, and he's a descendant of, according to Diodorus and Herodotus, he's a descendant of Sesostris, but it also says he's the son of the sun Helios, and he has he marries Hecate, the the goddess Hecate. This is all obviously mythologized, right? But this is what the sources say, and his his two daughters are Medea and Circe. So Medea and Circe are the daughters of Hecate. Now, because when you think of Hecate, you're thinking of like the goddess of magic, the underworld, uh, sorcery, like, and her daughters are Medea and Circe. And like, there is what me and a couple scholars that I know that I talk to, we call it like the Bacchic Empire. So the phrase magic wand, that we think of today, and like witches and witches who hold magic wands, like that's like an image that everyone knows. Like, why do we know that? What is that from? Is it from some Disney movie? No, it's from the ancient Greek world, and it's called rhabdos. And a rhabdos is basically a magic rod that Circe holds in her hand. And one of the oldest texts that actually mention this is the Odyssey. And Circe holds this rhabdos, this magic wand, and when she encounters Odysseus, she casts the wand at them, and they all turn into pigs, except for Odysseus, because he ate a plant that gave him immunity. And then she ends up falling in love with him for a year. They live together for a year, and then he moves on with his adventure. But anyways, the reason why I bring that up is because the earliest depictions of Jesus that we know about, we don't have a lot. There's not like first century drawings of Jesus that we know about. Like they start showing up in the 3rd century. I think it's something 3rd century maybe. And when we start finding these early depictions of Jesus, he's not the bearded guy in the sky that everyone knows today, like the European looking bearded French guy. He's a beardless young guy, looks like a young boy, and he's holding a rhabdos. He's holding a magic wand in his hand, and it's the same. It's this is and so that's you have scholars like Morton Smith who write books about Jesus being a magician. And even in the Talmud says that he was hung on Passover Eve for performing sorcery and idolatry, and that he was he was basically like the sorcerer. And it's like a whole different Jesus that we were not like taught. And so this the funniest part about it, I mentioned Cersei because in the text in the New Testament, Jesus confronts this legion, and he casts them into pigs, exactly how Cersei does with Odysseus and his men, and they're soldiers too. And everyone knows the story of Jesus turning the legion into swine, and they jump off the cliff into the water. That's ripped right from the Odyssey, from Cersei. That's the same thing Cersei does. And like, think about it for a second. How specific is that? It's like if it's one thing to say like I drank coffee today, and you can say, "Oh, you copied me. I drank coffee yesterday." Well, everyone drinks coffee. That's a normal thing. But to cast people into pigs, that is such a specific thing that you're gonna have a hard time convincing me that these stories are written independent, like the New Testament authors aren't drawing from this story of Cersei. And I think the reason why they're doing that is because they're trying to make Jesus as the better version of these older religious saviors, Cersei and Medea. They're trying to make him better than them. They're trying to make him the new version of that. And so Medea, the Medea actually links to Jesus as well, because Medea was known, and this is all over the sources in the ancient world. She was known for giving these they're called baptisms actually in Greek, baptists. And they're these healings by dipping people into water with heated water. And so these people would come to Medea from all over the place, and they would get in her baths and they'd get healed by her. And there's actually a group of Bacchic, Orphic people. I use those interchangeably because they really are. There's so much overlap between the Bacchans and the Orphics. Orpheus was a prophet of Dionysus, so the Orphics and the Bacchics, it's like tomato, tomato. Anyways, there's a group of Orphics who call themselves the Baptists, and they lived Corinth, in Athens, and I think Ephesus. And they were devotees of not only Dionysus, but this goddess named Cotys, Kotys. And she was like a crossbreed of Phrygian Cybele and Athena. So like she holds the spear, and she has a shield, or she has a helmet on sometimes, but she's also called like the Great Mother. But anyways, they performed baptisms, and I'm not just saying baptisms like I'm attributing a Christian word to it. No, they actually use the word Baptist, which means bathe. And so they were this worship purification ceremony of elaborate bathing rituals. It's attributed to Medea. They said that Medea, like there's Diogenes Laertius says this. Um, what's his name? Philostratus says this. There's a couple authors that say this, that she's the one that invented the purification bath ritual. So that she gets the credit for this. Like the whole Baptist movement has to go through Medea. That's why I wanted to talk about Medea so much, because like Medea, you get the word medicine from Medea. Medea, medicine. She's known for the symbol with the snakes. It's the Asclepius rod.
Yeah, of course.
Well, Medea is always depicted with snakes too, and she's a healer. She's using medicines and drugs to heal. Not only to that, to also kill as well. Like she killed a few people in these texts, and she was pretty badass, by the way. But yeah, the idea of medicine and salvation. They called her a soter, a savior, soteria. And so this is all this language that we see for Jesus was already being thrown around for Medea and Cersei way centuries before. That makes if that makes sense.
Like, it's a whole view that just, kind of changes everything. And on WB Yeats, because this is just a little note I want to add, because he's so interesting. And actually, he plays a role in later occultism because he was a member of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which is where a lot of like Hermetic and then eventually things like Thelema, Wicca, and a lot of modern esoteric ideas comes from. He actually, this is just my favorite tidbit about him, actually had a lot of interpersonal drama with Aleister Crowley. The two of them were kind of competing against each other in the occult circles at that time. There's a lot of really funny stories about the two of them, and there's a rumor that people like to debate the historicism of, but I just think it's hysterical. So I like to share it anyways, even if this perhaps didn't happen. That they were at this pub in the UK and Crowley was being so annoying that him and Yates got in like a bar fight and Yates kicked him down the stairs. Um, and this is like my favorite little bit of lore. There's a decent chance it happened, so I think it's worth sharing
I wouldn't
regardless.
doubt it. I wouldn't doubt it because you see those two are very different in their approach, but they're also engaged in very similar topics.
Yeah, and they had different like outlooks for it, right? Like Yates was much more pious, whereas Crowley had his. We all know Crowley, right? We know how he was. So I think,
He's like a Bacchant. He's like one of those Bacchants, you know.
yeah, and fundamentally they were in the same. We know for a fact they were in the same lodge at the same time. And so we know they didn't like each other, and a lot of the like metaphysical, magical dueling that happened between Crowley and the Hermeticists at the time did involve him. So it's a funny little historic dynamic that I love to bring up. Yeats is totally worth reading, though. He's one of the people who I think, since his poetry is so famous, which also does add to the Crowley Yeats bit, because Yeats was such a better poet than Crowley, and they were both trying to be poets at the same time.
Yeah,
Because his poetry is so good, I think people have overlooked a lot of his like esotericism, and it's actually really really interesting stuff what he's contributed to the esoteric occult world.
absolutely, for sure. I just want to point this out from Medea too. Is like I have to stress this. I can't say this enough. Her being a witch, her and Cersei as witches, was not negative. It was like I said this already, but like they were seen as heroes. They were seen as demigods. They were not seen as evil witches, even though they did do some very sketchy, you know, things in these texts. Like you would say, "Oh, that's not cool. She just killed somebody." But like, okay, we don't say that about Julius Caesar, who went into Gaul and slaughtered a bunch. Like, like why? Like, I just feel like okay, who cares? But like, these are people who are performing these magical rites, healing people, and contributing to medicine and technology and religion. That religious, that strive for that, feeling the presence of the gods. They were like at the forefront of that. They were like bringing all the rights to the table, basically. So, that's why I think Medea would be. If I was to take WB Yeats's approach, I would say Medea instead of Helen. And yeah, that's what I would do.
Well, pretty much all traditions have some sort of way of categorizing like good magic versus bad magic, right? The thing that people miss, which now some modern movements do this, but historically, no religion has broadly condemned magic as wholly bad. Sometimes they'll condemn that word, but every religion has magical, mystical things that they are okay with, whether they even go as far as just call them miracles or whatever. And so, this like good witch, bad witch distinction has always kind of existed. And so, there are several figures that people now call witches or sorcerers or sahir or whatever they want to use that largely were viewed as like good magicians. So, I mean, the term magician, I think, is a very neutral term. I think it gets loaded when you get into specific terms like witch, especially sorcerer. Sorcerer is probably the most maligned of the terms. But you know what I mean? Like, there's always a
Yeah,
moralism to it. And the truth is, there is good and there is bad magic, right? And so these distinctions with what we call what gets a little confusing to people, I think. But yeah, not all witchcraft is the same. Not all magic is really created equal.
yeah, and like um, the idea of Medea and Cersei being like evil witches totally comes post Christian era, and it's just because It's not because people's ideas change. I think it's because now we have, like, as Christians, as the church leaders, you have to keep Jesus ahead of everyone else. So you kind of have to polemicize all the people who came before Jesus, even if Jesus is literally copying Cersei, or performing rites that Medea performed. They don't care because it's Jesus now, and those are the old pagan figures, so those are evil now. So I think that happens because of that. I don't think it's any, like, they, like you said, there's people were looking at it in a whole different light. It's actually what we call science today is almost interchangeable with people what they describe magic in the ancient world. Like
Oh,
you're
the entire concept of science originates from magic. It's a history that's super interlinked. Like, ideas like humoric medicine, right, which has been debunked scientifically, actually came from a metaphysical understanding. And alchemy was the basis of a lot of modern chemistry. And the people who were scientific leaders in both the West and the East were largely occultist, right? Like the father of Arab philosophy and the big mind behind the Islamic Golden Age was someone who wrote treatises on astrology, right? And
yeah,
then in the West, you get people like Pythagoras, right? We think of him as a mathematician, but he also had a whole school of like mystical thought around him. Like there's this heavy overlap has existed for a long time. The separation of science from religion and science from magic and the kind of secularization of science is actually a pretty modern concept, right? Um,
yeah,
so
and
they're all more linked than it seems. And on the demonization aspect that we were discussing, what's so interesting to me is the demonization of pre-Christian philosophers, figures, whatever, isn't even consistent amongst Christianity, because you actually look at early Christian theologians, they had this term, righteous pagan or virtuous pagan, depending on who's writing about it, that they believed these people were actually, like, say, Plato and all these great thinkers that influenced Christian philosophy were actually just worshiping angels. They weren't actually like demonic Satanists. Whereas then later Protestants look at it and go, no, 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 those people are demonic. I even saw some people calling Platonism demonic, which I think is crazy.
it's crazy.
So you get this like even infighting amongst each other of like how far are you going to take this demonizing what came ahead, because eventually you run into a lot of problems, because if you call everything before your religion evil or ignorance or satanic or whatever term you want to throw at it, you're eventually gonna kind of mess with your own religion, because
Right. You create double
people things
standards.
come from what came before it, and so you end up like eradicating whole parts of your religion. You see this among certain strains of Christians and certain strains of like Islam, where like they'll literally demonize parts of their own religion that's objectively in there because the
Yeah,
people before it did it, and that you just start driving yourself a little bit crazy. I think no matter what religion you are, everyone needs to admit that things borrow from what's around it and what's before it. Like, I've said this to modern pagans and they get bothered when I say it to them. Like, if you're a neo pagan, you're gonna to some extent be pulling from the Abrahamic stuff you're surrounded by, just because, these lineages are broken, right? You're gonna subconsciously pull from what's around you no matter what. Just like how Christians, as we know, pulled from paganism, or Jews and Muslims, like they pulled from the paganism before them. They don't like to admit this, but it's true. Neo pagans do the exact same thing. It's just inevitable. People are influenced by what's around them. And I think this is just something that people broadly need to admit is a reality and is just okay. That's just the nature of religion, like it or not.
yeah, exactly. You create a double standard for yourself because you're gonna obviously be doing some of the same rights, same stuff. Like it's like, why is I always ask people this, like, John the Baptist is baptizing people before Jesus ever died and resurrected. What's he baptizing for? Like, what ever you ever wondered? Like, they'll go, oh yeah, I never thought about that. And it's like, well, all these other Baptist cults from Corinth and Athens, they're doing it, and you guys call it magic and sorcery. What's the difference? Like, so you create a double standard for yourself when you say all these other places are sorcery and demonic, but when we do it in Jesus' name, it's different. Like, no, you're just doing it different. It's the same thing.
Oh yeah, you're gonna drive yourself crazy with this stuff, because the truth is, like, there are some magics that are more virtuous or pious than others, but where the line is something that people are going to endlessly debate until time ends. It's a worthy debate to have, but it's never gonna stop, and the line's always gonna be moving around.
And
So
in fact, that's what, if you look at the Talmud text about Jesus, it says he was hanged on Passover Eve for leading Israel astray. Like they're called, and it says charged with sorcery. So then you even have going forward, they're looking forward at the new sects and saying, "Oh, those are sorcery." Like the Jews are saying that about Jesus. So it just can go. It goes in every direction. Um, but I did want to say something about the magic and science thing. Um, Fraser, James Fraser, sorry, he wrote the Golden Bow, and he said that there's three types of magic: sympathetic magic, homeopathic magic, and contagious magic. And the homeopathic is a lot of it's basically like what the ancients would call witchcraft or magic in the sense of using certain medicinal drugs or plants to heal or to do like to there's this ancient rite in the Pythagoreans were doing this actually, and they would take people who were sick and they would put them in a dark cold cave, and they would have them sit there and they'd put them on like drugs that would make them sleep, pretty much put them in comas, until they healed, and they would come out of these caves like refreshed and reborn basically. Um, Parmenides talks about this. Peter Green wrote a whole book about it, but that was considered a form of magic. They called it magic, but today we'd call that medicine or heal. We'd call that therapy. We have these different ways to approach certain things that in the ancient world was called magic. So there's just it's a continuum, like you said. Everything's like leading into as we get more knowledge as a society, we sort of categorize things differently and we figure out new things. But like ultimately, we're all striving towards the same thing. We're trying to improve, and we're using these things for the benefit, not for evil. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. And I think that's kind of a good sort of ending note. My final question for you is what like books or resources should people look at if they want to learn more about this stuff?
Oh, so you can check out Diodorus of Sicily. He has the big stories about Medea and Sesostris, if you want to read about that. Herodotus, which book was it? Book 7, where he talks about Medea and the Medes and all that stuff. Obviously, you can go to Homer's Odyssey and read about Circe in there. And yeah, it's all out there. Yeah, those are the ones that I'm drawing from the stories that I just told, though.
Yeah, I think that's super helpful. And I appreciate you sharing those recommendations with everyone. Where can people find you? Where's your corner of the internet?
Go to youtube.com/Gnostic Informant.
Perfect. It's a good channel. I have actually been on it before, so you can
Yeah,
see,
twice.
yeah, you can see us talking on there. And you also should check out my previous episode on this podcast with the Gnostic Informant. If you want to find me, my name is Georgina Rose or Dot Darling. I'm on every platform under the sun. And if you want to support this show, you can join our Patreon. If you join the Patreon, you get the pre-show, which is a bonus mini episode that I record right before my guest joins. That's on all sorts of fun topics. As well, you get a bonus episode every Neo-Pagan Sabbath. So that is 8 bonus episodes a year. Access to my archives. And if you're a high enough tier and you're one of the people who really support us, we appreciate your help. I will read out your name. So thank you to our top supporters, Abka, Charlotte, Dickon, Lee, Smalter. Thank you so, so much for your continued contributions. And I will see everyone listening to this show in the next episode. All right.